I remember the night Tom left. It wasn't like any other evening, though everything started out just the same. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the dresser mirror. My hair was still damp from the shower, and I couldn't bring myself to meet my own eyes. That's the funny thing about guilt. It's always there, creeping up on you in the quiet moments, catching you when you're most vulnerable. Tom stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, like a stone statue. I didn't have to ask if he knew. He knew. I could feel it in the air, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. We had been married for over 40 years, and in that time we had become experts in silence, avoiding the difficult conversations, sidestepping the cracks in our lives. But this silence was different. It was final. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were slow, deliberate, and they cut deeper than any scream ever could. "I'm leaving, Linda," he said, his eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. "You'll never see me again. But this isn't over for you." He walked out that night without so much as a backward glance. No packed bags, no slamming doors. Just a chilling goodbye that left me frozen in place, my heart hammering in my chest as his footsteps grew softer and softer down the hall. That was the last time I saw him. For weeks, I waited. At first, I told myself he needed space, time to cool off. Maybe he'd come back and we'd talk things through, even if I wasn't sure what there was left to say. But as the days passed, the dread settled in. He wasn't coming back, and that was when the fear took hold. Fear of what I'd done, fear of what he was capable of. You see, I didn't just lose my husband that night. I lost control of everything, my life, my sanity, my sense of who I was. Tom's absence was like a shadow that followed me everywhere, darkening every corner of my mind. And the worst part was, I knew this was only the beginning. His final words echoed in my mind over and over. "This isn't over for you." He was right. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. I thought the affair was the worst thing I could have done, but I was wrong. So wrong. It was only a spark, a small fire that I thought would burn out quickly. But now, as I sit here alone in this empty house, I see the flames have spread, consuming everything in their path. And the person I have to thank for all of this, myself. And perhaps Tom. But there's one thing I know for sure. Wherever Tom is, he's still out there, watching, waiting. And I'm left here, haunted by the last thing he said to me. When I think back to how it all began, I can't pinpoint an exact moment. It wasn't as though I woke up one day and decided to throw everything away, my marriage, my dignity, my peace of mind. It happened slowly, in the smallest, most unnoticeable ways. A smile that lingered too long, a conversation that felt too personal, and then, before I knew it, I was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump. It all started at the gym. After I retired from teaching, I found myself restless. My days, once filled with the energy of children and the hustle of lesson plans, were now endless stretches of quiet. Tom, being older, had already retired from his job as a security consultant, but he was always busy with his own hobbies, fishing, reading military history, or tinkering with things in the garage. We didn't spend much time together anymore, not like we used to. So I joined a local fitness center, more for the routine than anything else. That's where I met Ryan. He was a personal trainer, young, so much younger than me, charming, and always with a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He had that kind of energy that was contagious. I hadn't felt that alive in years. At first it was innocent. I'd see him at the gym, we'd chat between sets, and he'd give me advice on my routine. I knew he flirted with all the women who came in, especially the older ones like me. It was harmless, or at least I told myself it was. But then things started to shift. I looked forward to our conversations more than I should have. I'd catch myself thinking about him outside of the gym, wondering what he was doing if he thought about me. And when he started complimenting me, telling me I didn't look my age, that I was more interesting than the girls his age, it did something to me. It made me feel seen. Tom had stopped seeing me years ago. We were still together, of course, but we weren't really together. We moved around each other in the house like ghosts, passing through the same spaces, but never really connecting. He was always buried in his books or his projects, and I felt more like his roommate than his wife. Ryan made me feel young again, desirable, like I still had something to offer. The night it happened was like any other night. I had been going to the gym regularly for months by then, and Ryan and I had developed a routine of talking after my sessions. He'd offer me a protein shake, and we'd sit in the back office chatting about life. That night, I remember feeling particularly lonely. Tom had been away for a work conference, and the house had felt especially empty. Ryan asked if I wanted to grab a drink after the gym, and without thinking, I said yes. I knew, deep down, that it was a bad idea, but I ignored the warning bells in my head. We went to a small bar near the gym, had a few drinks, and before I knew it, we were sitting in his car, parked in a quiet lot. I wish I could say it was a whirlwind of passion, that it swept me off my feet and made me forget the world for a moment. But the truth is, it was clumsy, awkward, and filled with regret, even as it was happening. It wasn't love. It wasn't even lust, not really. It was just two people filling a void, grasping for something they didn't have. Afterward, I felt sick. I couldn't look at him, couldn't even speak. Ryan didn't seem to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. He kissed me on the cheek and told me he'd see me at the gym the next day. I sat in my car for a long time before I drove home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. That night, I lay in bed next to Tom, who had returned from his trip, staring at the ceiling. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. The guilt gnawed at me, but I told myself it was a one-time mistake, a lapse in judgment that would never happen again. I convinced myself that I could bury it, that no one had to know. But secrets have a way of creeping into the light, no matter how hard you try to keep them hidden. And in the end, it wasn't me who brought the truth out into the open. It was Tom. I never imagined Tom would find out. I thought I'd been careful, covering my tracks, deleting messages, keeping things discreet. But Tom was smarter than I gave him credit for. He always had been. After years in the military and his work in security, he had a mind that was sharp, always watching, always observing. I should have known better. The confrontation happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon, a few weeks after the night with Ryan. I had been living in a state of denial, telling myself that everything would go back to normal, that the guilt would fade, and I could forget it ever happened. But I was wrong. I was in the kitchen, making tea when Tom walked in. He was quiet, too quiet, and there was something in his eyes that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me as I went about my task. The tension in the room was suffocating. Finally, he spoke. "Linda, we need to talk." I froze. My hands were shaking, and I had to set the kettle down before I dropped it. I turned to face him, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. My heart sank. He unlocked the screen and held it out to me, his expression unreadable. I took the phone, my stomach churning, as I looked down at the message on the screen. It was from Ryan, a simple, stupid text that I hadn't deleted, one I had forgotten about. It wasn't even explicit, just a casual message about meeting up at the gym. But Tom wasn't a fool. He didn't need to see more to understand what had happened. "Care to explain?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I couldn't speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, and the room seemed to spin around me. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Tom took a step closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "How long, Linda?" he asked, his voice still calm, but there was an edge to it now, a barely contained fury that terrified me. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. It was just once," I whispered. "It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake." Tom's jaw tightened, and he turned away from me, pacing across the kitchen. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until I thought I might suffocate under it. Finally, he stopped and faced me again, his expression cold. "I don't care how many times it was, Linda. What matters is that you did it. You betrayed me. You betrayed us." I wanted to say something, to defend myself, but there was nothing I could say. He was right. I had betrayed him, and there was no excuse for it. "I'm leaving," he said suddenly, his voice sharp and final. "I can't stay here, not with you." Panic surged through me. "Tom, please." He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "I'm done, Linda. You'll never see me again. But this isn't over for you." And with that, he walked out the door, leaving me standing there alone, with nothing but the weight of my guilt and the sound of the rain against the windows. Tom's departure hit me like a freight train. For the first few days, I was in shock. I went through the motions, waking up, eating, going to the gym. But it was as though I was moving through water, slow and heavy, everything muffled by the weight of his absence. The house felt empty without him, too big, too quiet. I found myself listening for the sound of his footsteps, the creak of the floorboards in the hall, but there was nothing, just silence. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not the kids, not my friends. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain that Tom had walked out on me because of my own stupidity? How could I face the shame, the judgment? So I kept it to myself, hoping that he'd come back, that we could talk, that I could fix this somehow. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized he wasn't coming back. He didn't call. He didn't text. It was as though he had disappeared off the face of the earth. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail every time. I left messages begging him to come home, to talk to me, but he never responded. That's when I started to panic. What if something had happened to him? What if he was hurt or worse? I called the police, but they couldn't do anything. Tom was a grown man, and there was no evidence that he was in any danger. They filed a report, but it was clear they didn't think it was anything serious. My panic grew when our children, Anna and Brian, called me, asking why they hadn't heard from their father. I tried to brush it off, telling them he was busy with work, that he was traveling, but I could hear the suspicion in their voices. They knew something was wrong, and I knew that sooner or later I would have to tell them the truth. When Anna arrived a week later, I knew I couldn't hide it anymore. She walked into the house, her face drawn with worry. "Mom, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "Where's Dad?" I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I burst into tears, the weight of everything crashing down on me all at once. Anna rushed to my side, wrapping her arms around me, and I collapsed into her embrace, sobbing like a child. "I'm sorry," I whispered through my tears. "I'm so sorry." Anna pulled back, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Sorry for what, Mom? What happened?" I wiped my eyes, trying to compose myself, but it was no use. The truth came spilling out, messy and raw. I told her about the affair, about Ryan, about Tom finding out and walking out. I told her everything. By the time I finished, Anna was staring at me, her face pale, her mouth set in a thin line. "I don't believe this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How could you, Mom? How could you do that to Dad?" I shook my head, unable to meet her eyes. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know what I was thinking. I made a mistake, and now he's gone." Anna stood up abruptly, pacing the room. Does Brian know?" I shook my head again. "Number I haven't told him." She let out a long, exasperated sigh, running a hand through her hair. "You need to tell him, Mom. He deserves to know." "I know," I said softly. I didn't know how." Anna stopped pacing and looked at me, her expression hard. "You need to figure it out, Mom. Because if Dad doesn't come back, we need to know what we're dealing with. And I need to know that you're going to be honest with us from now on." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I will. I promise." She left shortly after that, her face still tight with anger and disappointment. I knew I had hurt her, just like I had hurt Tom, and now I had to face the consequences. Brian was less understanding when I finally told him. He called me from his home in Arizona, his voice filled with disbelief. "You cheated on Dad?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "What the hell, Mom? How could you do something like that?" I had no defense, no explanation that would make sense. "I don't know, Brian. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake." "Well, yeah, no kidding," he snapped. "What are you going to do now?" I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't know what I was going to do. All I could do was wait and hope that Tom would come back, that we could somehow salvage what was left of our marriage. But deep down, I knew that was unlikely. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. In the meantime, I had to deal with the fallout. Word spread quickly in our small town. People whispered behind my back, and I could feel their judgment every time I walked into the grocery store or the post office. Even my friends began to distance themselves from me, offering pitying glances and awkward excuses when I tried to reach out. The worst part was Ryan. He hadn't left town, and I saw him often at the gym. Every time I walked in, he'd flash that same charming smile, as though nothing had changed. He tried to talk to me, to rekindle whatever spark we had, but I shut him down every time. I couldn't even look at him without feeling sick. I hated him for what had happened, but I hated myself even more. I was the one who had let things get out of control. I was the one who had made the choices that led to this disaster. And now I was paying the price. As the weeks went by, my life began to unravel in ways I couldn't have imagined. The initial shock of Tom's departure had faded, but in its place was a gnawing sense of dread that grew with each passing day. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen, that Tom's absence was only the beginning of a much larger storm. It started with the phone calls. At first, they were infrequent, just a few times a week. The phone would ring, and when I answered, there would be silence on the other end. I thought it was a glitch, maybe a telemarketer's automated system gone wrong. But then the calls became more frequent. Every day, sometimes multiple times a day, the phone would ring, and no one would be there. It wasn't just the phone calls either. I started receiving strange emails, messages with no subject line, filled with random strings of numbers and letters. I deleted them, assuming they were spam, but they kept coming. And then there were the notes. One morning, I found a small piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. It was folded neatly, with no writing on the outside. I unfolded it, my heart racing as I read the words inside. "I'm watching." My hands shook as I stared at the note, my mind racing. Who had left it? Was it Tom? Was he trying to scare me, to punish me for what I had done? Or was it someone else? Someone who knew about the affair, about my betrayal. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. This was deliberate. Someone was watching me, and they wanted me to know it. The paranoia started to consume me. I couldn't leave the house without feeling like I was being followed. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the street, looking for any sign of someone watching from the shadows. At night, I double-checked all the locks, pulled the curtains tight, and lay in bed listening for any sound that might indicate someone was outside. My sleep became restless, filled with nightmares. I dreamed of Tom, standing at the foot of our bed, staring at me with cold, accusing eyes. I dreamed of Ryan, his charming smile twisting into something cruel as he whispered in my ear, reminding me of the night we spent together. And I dreamed of the house burning down around me, the flames licking at my skin as I stood there, unable to move, unable to escape. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. Anna and Brian had made it clear that they were still angry with me, and my friends had all but abandoned me. I was alone, trapped in my own personal hell, with no one to turn to for help. That's when Earl showed up. Earl had been Tom's best friend for as long as I could remember. They had served together in the military, and even after Tom retired, they stayed close. Earl was a no-nonsense kind of guy, gruff, straightforward, and fiercely loyal to Tom. When he knocked on my door one afternoon, I wasn't surprised to see him. I had been expecting him in a way. "Linda," he said as I opened the door, his expression serious. "We need to talk." I stepped aside to let him in, my stomach churning with anxiety. Earl had always intimidated me, but now, with Tom gone, he seemed even more imposing. He sat down at the kitchen table, his eyes scanning the room as though he were assessing the situation, looking for clues. "I've been trying to reach Tom," he said, his voice gruff. "He's not answering his phone." I swallowed hard, unsure of how much I should tell him. He left," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Earl's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean he left?" I took a deep breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "He found out about the affair. He walked out. I haven't seen or heard from him since." For a moment, Earl didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at me with those cold, calculating eyes. I could tell he was piecing it all together, trying to make sense of what had happened. Finally, he spoke. "Tom's not the type to just disappear," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You know that, Linda. Something's not right here." I nodded, my throat tight. "I know," I whispered. I think he's watching me." Earl's expression didn't change, but I could see the gears turning in his mind. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "What makes you think that?" I told him about the phone calls, the emails, the note on my car. As I spoke, I could see the concern growing in his eyes, though he tried to keep his face neutral. When I finished, he let out a long, slow breath. "Tom's been in some deep stuff over the years," he said quietly. "His work in security wasn't always above board. There are people out there who might have a reason to come after him, or you." My heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying, Earl? Do you think someone's trying to hurt me because of Tom?" Earl didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, pacing the length of the kitchen, his hands on his hips. Finally, he stopped and turned to face me. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we need to find Tom before it's too late." It was Earl who first suggested that we go looking for Tom. He seemed convinced that Tom hadn't simply left because of my affair, but that something much larger was at play. I didn't know whether to believe him. Tom had never been one to talk about his work in detail, and over the years I had stopped asking questions, but now, faced with the possibility that he had disappeared for reasons beyond our broken marriage, I felt an unsettling mix of fear and hope. Fear that something terrible had happened to him, hope that maybe this wasn't all my fault. Earl and I started by retracing Tom's steps. We went through his things, his office, his files, his computer, looking for any clue as to where he might have gone. It felt invasive, like I was prying into parts of his life I had no business being in, but I told myself it was necessary. We needed answers. That's when we found it. Hidden in the back of his desk drawer, behind old receipts and paperwork, was a small, worn notebook. The pages were filled with Tom's neat handwriting, detailing names, dates, and places that I didn't recognize. At first glance, it looked like a simple logbook, but as Earl read through it, his face grew more and more grim. "This isn't good," he muttered, flipping through the pages. "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing. Earl glanced up at me, his expression serious. "These names, they're people Tom worked with. Dangerous people." I stared at him, confused. "But Tom's work was in security. What does that have to do with dangerous people?" Earl let out a long breath, closing the notebook and setting it down on the table. "Tom wasn't just in security, Linda. He was involved in some high-level, off-the-books operations, things that weren't exactly legal." I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What kind of things?" Earl hesitated for a moment before answering. "Private contracts, black ops, stuff the government didn't want to get their hands dirty with." I sank into a chair, my head spinning. This was too much. I had always known that Tom's work was secretive, that he had been involved in some dangerous situations during his time in the military, but I had no idea it went this far. "Why didn't he tell me?" I whispered, more to myself than to Earl. "He was protecting you," Earl said, his voice softening. "The less you knew, the safer you were." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. How could I have been married to this man for 40 years and not known who he really was? How could I have been so blind? Earl continued flipping through the notebook, pausing at certain entries, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a while, he looked up at me again, his expression tense. "There's a name here," he said slowly. "A place in Montana. Could be where he's headed." Montana. It seemed so random, so far away from everything we had built together. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Tom had always talked about wanting to get away from it all, to live off the grid, far from the chaos of the world. Maybe he had finally decided to do it, to disappear completely. Earl and I packed our bags and booked a flight to Montana the next day. I didn't tell Anna or Brian where I was going. I couldn't bear the thought of explaining it all to them, not yet. I needed to know the truth first. When we arrived in Montana, we rented a car and drove for hours through the vast, empty landscape. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, and the sky seemed to stretch on forever. It was beautiful in a way, but it also felt isolated, as though we were the only two people left in the world. The address in Tom's notebook led us to a small remote cabin nestled deep in the woods. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance. No car, no sign of life. But as we approached, I noticed the faintest wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. My heart pounded in my chest. Was Tom really here, after all this time? Earl knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the handle, and to my surprise, it opened easily. The cabin was sparse, just a few pieces of furniture, a bed, a table, a wood stove, but there were signs that someone had been living here recently. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the table, and a stack of newspapers lay on the floor by the bed. Earl moved through the cabin, checking each room while I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind racing. If Tom had been here, where was he now? Had he left again, knowing we were coming? Earl emerged from the back room, holding a small box in his hands. "Found this," he said, setting it down on the table. The box was old, the wood worn and cracked, and it was locked with a small metal latch. Earl pried it open with a knife, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and documents. As I sifted through the papers, my heart sank. These were all things from Tom's past. Old military records, photos of him with men I didn't recognize, letters that hinted at operations I couldn't begin to understand. But there was one letter that stood out. It was newer, the paper crisp and unmarked by time. I unfolded it with shaking hands, my eyes scanning the words. Linda, if you're reading this, it means you've found me, or at least you've come close. I didn't want it to end this way, but I had no choice. My life has always been filled with secrets, things I couldn't tell you, things I couldn't explain. I knew you'd be hurt when I left, but I couldn't stay. Not after what I did, not after what you did. I've made too many enemies over the years, Linda. People who would do anything to hurt me. And now they know about you. They know about us. I had to disappear for your sake as much as mine. But know this, I'm not coming back. Not now. Not ever. This is my goodbye. You'll never see me again. But I'll always be watching. Tom. My hands shook as I read the letter again, trying to make sense of it. Tom hadn't left because of the affair, or at least not entirely. He had left because his past had finally caught up with him, and now I was caught in the middle of it all. The drive back from Montana was a blur. Earl didn't say much, and neither did I. There was nothing left to say. We had found what we were looking for, but the answers only raised more questions. Tom was gone, truly gone, and there was no way to bring him back. I thought about the letter constantly, replaying the words over and over in my mind. I'll always be watching. What did that mean? Was Tom still out there, somewhere, keeping an eye on me from the shadows? Or was it just a figure of speech, meant to haunt me with the memory of what I had lost? I didn't know. I wasn't sure I ever would. When we got back to town, I returned to the house, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of the past. Every room reminded me of Tom, his chair in the living room, his books on the shelves, the sound of his voice echoing in my mind. I couldn't stay there, not anymore. I called Anna and Brian and told them I was selling the house. They didn't ask why. They didn't need to. They knew as well as I did that this chapter of my life was over, and there was no going back. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, away from the memories that had weighed me down for so long. It was a modest place, just one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a view of the street below. But it was mine. It was a fresh start. For a while, things were quiet. The phone calls stopped, the strange emails disappeared, and there were no more notes on my car. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, I could move on. But then, one night, I found another letter. It was tucked under the door of my apartment, folded neatly in half, just like the others. My hands trembled as I picked it up, my heart racing in my chest. I unfolded the paper slowly, dreading what I would find. Linda, I told you I'd always be watching. Don't forget that. Tom, I dropped the letter, my breath catching in my throat. He was still out there, watching, waiting, haunting me with his absence. I stood there, frozen, the letter lying on the floor at my feet. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to escape the shadow that Tom had cast over my life. He was gone, but he wasn't really gone, not in the ways that mattered. I thought about calling Earl, about telling him what I had found, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Tom wasn't coming back, not in the way I wanted him to. He had made that clear, so I did the only thing I could. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and sat down in the dark, waiting for the next letter, the next reminder that Tom was still out there somewhere watching. And that's where I am now, sitting in the dark, alone with my thoughts, haunted by the choices I made and the man I lost. I don't know if I'll ever be free of him, of the memories, of the guilt, but I do know one thing. This isn't over. Not by a long shot.
You don't plan for moments like these. They sneak up on you, quiet and unassuming, until suddenly your world shifts and nothing feels the same. It was a Tuesday night, ordinary in every way. Dinner was simple: roast chicken, steamed vegetables, and a bottle of red wine that Dean opened but didn't drink much of. He was always distracted, glued to his phone or buried in work, even at the dinner table. Sebastian had only been living with us for a few months, but his presence changed everything. At 27, he was still trying to figure out his life, moving back home after a failed business venture. Dean thought he was being responsible, giving his son a place to regroup. I thought it was a ticking time bomb, ready to explode under the pressure of their mismatched expectations. The accidental touch happened midway through dinner. My foot shifted under the table, brushing against Seb's leg. It was a fleeting moment, so small it shouldn't have mattered. But the way he looked at me after, his eyes dark and searching, made my breath catch. I told myself it was nothing, an accident, a moment that would pass. But it didn't. That touch lingered, haunting me long after the plates were cleared and the house went quiet. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. This is the story of how a single moment unraveled everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and the delicate line between right and wrong. It's funny how your life can feel full and empty at the same time. That's how I often describe my marriage to Dean. He's a good man by any conventional measure, successful, stable, and dependable. But that stability has always come with a cost, a distance between us that no amount of time together could seem to bridge. I met Dean 15 years ago at a design expo. I was there editing a freelance piece on emerging architectural trends, and he was presenting one of his firm's projects. He swept me off my feet with his confidence and vision, painting a picture of a future that felt like it had room for me. I thought I'd finally found someone who could be my partner in every sense of the word. But over time, Dean's world became narrower, consumed by deadlines, clients, and blueprints. I became a supporting character in his life, a role I played so well that even I started to forget who I was before him. When Dean's son, Sebastian, moved back in, it added a new dynamic to our already fragile balance. Sebastian, or Seb as I'd come to call him, was 27 and carrying the weight of a failure he didn't talk about. His startup, some tech venture Dean had enthusiastically funded, had crashed after less than a year. I didn't know the details, only that it left Seb adrift and Dean quietly disappointed. "Give him time," Dean said one evening as we sat in the living room. "He's figuring things out." "Time won't fix everything," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. Dean shot me a look, his brow furrowing. "He's my son, Elise. He needs our support." I nodded, biting back the retort that hovered on the tip of my tongue. Seb wasn't an easy presence in the house. He spent most of his time holed up in his room, emerging only for meals or the occasional late-night beer. When we did interact, it was polite but guarded, as though we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. I tried to connect with him in small ways, leaving fresh towels on his bed, making his favorite meals. But he never seemed to notice. Or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. Still, there were moments when I saw glimpses of the person he used to be. Like when he'd play piano in the evenings, his fingers moving effortlessly over the keys, filling the house with music that felt too big for its walls. In those moments, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't quite name. The night it happened, everything started out so ordinary. Dean had been working late, as usual, and I was left to prepare dinner on my own. I roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and uncorked a bottle of red wine that I knew Dean would only sip once before setting aside. Seb came downstairs just as I was setting the table, his hair mussed as though he'd just rolled out of bed. "Smells good," he said, his voice low. "Thanks," I replied, offering a faint smile. Dean arrived shortly after, loosening his tie as he walked in the door. "Sorry I'm late," he said, brushing a kiss across my cheek. We sat down together, a rare occurrence these days, and began eating in silence, the only sounds the clinking of cutlery and the occasional rustle of Dean's phone as he checked his messages. It happened halfway through the meal. I shifted in my seat, stretching my legs beneath the table, and my foot brushed against something warm. I froze, realizing a moment too late that it was Seb's leg. "Sorry," I murmured, pulling my foot back. It's fine, Seb said quickly, his voice calm but his eyes darting to mine. The moment passed in an instant, but it left a charge in the air that I couldn't ignore. For the rest of the meal, I was hyper-aware of him. The way he shifted in his seat, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the table, the way he glanced at me when he thought I wasn't looking. After dinner, Dean retreated to his office to catch up on work, leaving me to clear the table. Seb lingered in the kitchen, leaning against the counter as I loaded the dishwasher. "Dinner was good," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Thanks," I replied, not looking up. There was a pause, heavy and charged. I felt his eyes on me, and when I finally turned to face him, I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. He looked away quickly, clearing his throat. "Good night," he said, disappearing up the stairs before I could respond. That night, as I lay in bed beside Dean, I couldn't stop replaying the moment under the table. It was such a small thing, so fleeting, but it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite define. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. Seb and I danced around each other, our interactions charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed willing to address. I found myself hyper-aware of his presence in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. The sound of his footsteps on the stairs, the scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me, all of it felt magnified, impossible to ignore. Dean, oblivious to the undercurrents in the house, continued to bury himself in work. He'd leave early in the mornings and return late at night, often too exhausted to do more than exchange a few pleasantries before heading to bed. "You've been quiet lately," he remarked one evening as we sat on the couch. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. He nodded, already distracted by the emails on his phone. A few nights later, I found myself in the kitchen, unable to sleep. I was pouring a glass of water when I heard footsteps behind me. "Couldn't sleep?" Seb asked, his voice low. I turned to find him standing in the doorway, his hair disheveled and his expression unreadable. "Something like that," I replied. He stepped closer, leaning against the counter. "Same here." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, heavy with everything we weren't saying. "About the other night," Seb began, his voice trailing off. "It was nothing," I said quickly, my heart racing. "Was it?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. After that late-night encounter in the kitchen, the tension in the house became unbearable. Seb and I continued to avoid any direct acknowledgement of what had passed between us, but it lingered, simmering beneath every word, every glance, every breath. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, a fabrication of a restless mind and a lonely heart. But deep down, I knew better. It was a Saturday morning, unseasonably warm for spring. Dean had left early for a site visit, leaving Seb and me alone in the house. I stayed in my room longer than usual, hoping to avoid the awkwardness of sharing the same space. But hunger eventually won out, and I ventured downstairs to make breakfast. Seb was already there, sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of coffee and his laptop open in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone light. I busied myself at the stove, determined to keep the interaction brief. But as the minutes ticked by, I felt his gaze on me, heavy and searching. "Do you want eggs?" I asked, my voice too bright. "Sure," he said, setting his mug down. The silence stretched as I scrambled the eggs, the only sound the soft sizzle of the pan. I could feel the tension thickening, pressing down on me like a weight. As we ate, I tried to make small talk, asking about his plans for the day. He answered in clipped sentences, his usual aloofness amplified by something I couldn't quite name. Finally, he set his fork down and looked at me, his expression serious. "Elise," he began, his voice soft but steady. "Can we talk about what's been happening?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "There's nothing to talk about," I said quickly, my words spilling out in a rush. His brow furrowed, frustration flickering across his face. "You keep saying that, but it's not true. We both know it's not." "Seb, I'm not trying to make this harder for you," he interrupted, his voice gentler now, "but I can't keep pretending like nothing's changed." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "It was an accident," I said, my voice trembling. That's all it was. He shook his head, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't just the touch, Elise. It's everything since then. The way we avoid each other, the way you look at me. I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came. Later that afternoon, I decided to get out of the house, hoping a change of scenery would help clear my mind. I went to the park, a quiet place I often visited when I needed to think. I didn't expect Seb to follow me. I was sitting on a bench, staring at the small pond in the center of the park when I heard his voice. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. I glanced up, startled to see him standing there, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. "Sure," I said after a moment, scooting over to make room. He sat down beside me, his shoulder brushing mine briefly. For a while, neither of us spoke. We watched the ducks glide across the water, their movements calm and unhurried. "This used to be my favorite spot," Seb said finally, breaking the silence. "Really?" He nodded. "When I was a kid, my mom used to bring me here. We'd sit by the pond for hours, feeding the ducks and talking about everything and nothing." There was a wistfulness in his voice, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I miss her," he said quietly. I felt a pang of sympathy, my chest tightening. "She'd be proud of you, you know." He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I doubt that." "She would," I insisted. "You're smart, talented, and resilient. She'd see that." Seb turned to look at me, his eyes softening. "You're the only one who thinks so." The sun was beginning to set, casting the park in hues of gold and pink. I stood, brushing off my hands. "We should head back." Seb nodded, but as I turned to leave, he reached for my hand, stopping me in my tracks. "Elise," he said, his voice low. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Thank you," he said, his gaze holding mine, "for being there, for seeing me." Before I could respond, he let go of my hand, his touch lingering even after he stepped away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with thoughts of Seb and the moment in the park. Around midnight, I went downstairs to get some water, hoping the cool air would help clear my head. I wasn't expecting to find Seb there, sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "No," I admitted, crossing the room to sit beside him. For a while we sat in silence, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. "I keep thinking about the park," Seb said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, my chest tightening. "Seb, I know it's wrong," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know we shouldn't, but I can't stop feeling this way." My breath caught, and I felt a rush of emotions, fear, guilt, longing, all colliding at once. "Seb, we can't," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not right." "Why not?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. "Why can't we just be honest about what we feel?" I didn't have an answer. He leaned closer, his gaze flicking to my lips before meeting my eyes again. "Elise," he whispered, his voice breaking. And then, before I could stop him or myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss was brief, tentative, but it felt like the culmination of every unspoken word, every stolen glance, every moment that had led us here. When it ended, we both pulled back, breathless and stunned. "I'm sorry," I said quickly, standing and moving away from him. "Don't be," he said softly, his eyes following me. But I was. I was sorry for everything. The kiss, the feelings I couldn't seem to control, and the line we'd just crossed. In the days following that kiss, the house felt like a trap, every corner brimming with the weight of what we'd done. I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but it was like walking a tightrope over a chasm, each step more precarious than the last. Seb and I didn't talk about it, not directly. But the air between us was thick with unspoken words, and the tension only grew with every passing day. Dean, oblivious as ever, continued to bury himself in his work, his presence in the house more of a shadow than a reality. He'd leave early, come home late, and spend most evenings in his office, poring over blueprints and spreadsheets. And yet, even his absence wasn't enough to ease my guilt. I tried to avoid Seb as much as possible. I started leaving the house early, taking long walks or spending hours at the library under the pretense of needing a change of scenery. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape my thoughts, or the memory of that night. One afternoon, as I was returning from one of my self-imposed exiles, I found Seb in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. "You've been out a lot lately," he said without looking up. "Just needed some fresh air," I replied, forcing my voice to sound casual. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. You don't have to avoid me, you know. I'm not avoiding you, I said quickly, too quickly. He smirked, setting the knife down. Right? I felt my cheeks flush and turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. Elise, he said softly, and the way he said my name made my heart ache. I paused, my back to him. I'm not sorry about what happened, he said. Are you? I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I walked away, my chest tightening with every step. It was only a matter of time before Dean started to notice the shift in the household dynamic. You've been quiet lately, he remarked one evening as we sat at the dinner table. I shrugged, keeping my eyes on my plate. Just tired. Dean nodded, but his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than usual. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, he appeared in the doorway of our bedroom. Is everything okay? He asked, his tone cautious. Of course, I replied, forcing a smile. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you? Of course, I repeated, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. He nodded slowly, but I could see the doubt flickering in his eyes. One night, unable to sleep, I went downstairs to make tea. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that felt almost oppressive. I was pouring water into the teapot when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Seb standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice low. I shook my head, my heart pounding. He stepped into the kitchen, his presence filling the space in a way that made it hard to breathe. Elise, he began, his voice soft but firm. We can't keep pretending like nothing's happening. I set the teapot down, my hands trembling. Seb, please. No, he said, stepping closer. I need to say this. He paused, his eyes searching mine. I care about you, more than I should, and I know this is complicated, but I can't ignore what I feel. His words hit me like a tidal wave, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. Seb, this isn't right, I said finally, my voice trembling. Maybe not, he replied, but it's real. The next day I met my friend Margaret for coffee. She was one of the few people who'd stuck by me through the ups and downs of my marriage, her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude a source of both comfort and frustration. You seem distracted, she said, eyeing me over the rim of her cup. Just a lot on my mind, I replied, stirring my tea. She raised an eyebrow. Anything you want to talk about? No, I said quickly, too quickly. Her eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing. You know, you're a terrible liar. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. It's nothing, really. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her expression skeptical. Whatever it is, just be careful. Secrets have a way of coming out when you least expect them. Her words stayed with me long after we parted ways. Dean decided to host a small family gathering the following weekend, a barbecue in the backyard, just the three of us and a few of his colleagues. I spent the day preparing food, my nerves on edge as I tried to juggle the logistics of hosting with the constant undercurrent of tension between Seb and me. As the guests arrived, I plastered on a smile, falling into the familiar rhythm of playing hostess. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the conversation, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. It happened toward the end of the evening. Most of the guests had left, and Dean was in the kitchen cleaning up. Seb and I were outside, gathering the last of the plates from the patio table. As I reached for a plate, my hand brushed against his and the contact sent a jolt through me. Elise, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I froze, my heart pounding. Before I could respond, Dean stepped outside, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. What's going on here? He asked, his tone sharp. Nothing, I said quickly, stepping back. Dean's gaze flicked between us, suspicion darkening his expression. You've been acting strange lately, he said, his voice tight. Both of you. Dean, you're imagining things, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Am I? He shot back, his eyes narrowing. The silence that followed was deafening. That night, I lay awake, the weight of Dean's suspicion pressing down on me like a physical force. I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. Seb, too, seemed on edge, his usual confidence replaced with a quiet tension that I hadn't seen before. We were on a collision course, and there was no way to stop it. Secrets have a way of growing heavier with time, like stones in your pocket as you wade into deep water. Every step feels harder. every breath tighter. I thought I could carry the weight of mine forever, but as the days passed, I began to realize that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply you try to bury it. The kiss with Seb was like a splinter I couldn't pull out. It festered in every quiet moment, invading my thoughts when I least expected it. I replayed it endlessly, the feel of his lips, the way his hand had lingered on mine, the way he'd whispered my name like it meant something. But what haunted me most was the look in his eyes afterward. Hope, longing, and something else I couldn't quite name. I told myself it had to end. That night, I had vowed to myself that it wouldn't happen again. But the more I tried to distance myself, the closer we seemed to drift. A few days after the barbecue, I found myself in the kitchen early one morning, staring blankly at the coffee pot as it sputtered and hissed. Dean had already left for work, his absence a relief. Seb walked in a few minutes later, his hair still mussed from sleep. He was wearing a plain gray t-shirt and sweatpants, his usual casual attire, but something about the way he carried himself made it impossible to look away. "Morning," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes on the coffee pot. For a moment we stood in silence, the tension between us palpable. "Elise," he said finally, his voice soft. I turned to face him, my chest tightening at the way he was looking at me. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "Pretending like nothing's wrong." "There's nothing wrong," I said quickly, though my voice lacked conviction. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "You don't believe that any more than I do." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk to clear my head. The park had become my refuge, a place where I could pretend, if only for a little while, that my life wasn't unraveling. I sat on a bench near the pond, watching the ducks glide across the water. The spring air was warm, the scent of blooming flowers heavy in the breeze. I was so lost in thought that I didn't hear Seb approach until he spoke. "Mind if I join you?" I looked up, startled to see him standing there. "Sure," I said after a moment, scooting over to make room. He sat down beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. For a while, neither of us spoke, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low. "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. "About us," he said, his gaze fixed on the pond. "About what happened." I felt my chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "It can't happen again," I said, my voice trembling. "Why not?" he asked, turning to face me. "Because it's wrong," I said, though the words felt hollow. Seb shook his head, his expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "Do you really believe that?" "Yes," I said, though my voice wavered. He reached for my hand, his touch sending a jolt through me. "Elise, I care about you, more than I should, and I think you feel the same." I pulled my hand away, tears stinging my eyes. "Seb, please, don't do this." That evening, Dean came home earlier than usual, his presence a reminder of the life I was supposed to be living. He kissed my cheek as he walked into the kitchen, his touch brief and perfunctory. "What's for dinner?" he asked, his tone distracted. "Roast chicken," I replied, forcing a smile. He nodded, already scrolling through his phone. As we ate, I found myself watching him, searching for some sign of the man I had married all those years ago. But he was a stranger to me now, his attention always elsewhere. For the first time, I wondered if he even noticed the growing distance between us, or if he cared. 2 nights later, everything came to a head. It started with a simple question. Dean had been working late again, and I was cleaning up after dinner when he walked in, his expression tense. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. "About what?" I asked, though my stomach churned with unease. "About you and Seb," he said, his eyes narrowing. I froze, my heart pounding. "What about us?" "Don't play dumb, Elise," he snapped. "I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you've been acting lately. Something's going on." "You're being ridiculous," I said quickly, though my voice shook. "Am I?" he shot back, stepping closer. "Because it doesn't feel that way." The argument escalated quickly, his accusations growing sharper with every word. "Do you even love me anymore?" he demanded, his voice breaking. I stared at him, my chest tightening. "Dean, don't," he said, cutting me off. "Don't lie to me." For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. His face fell, the anger draining from his expression, replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite place. Dean left that night, slamming the door behind him. I didn't try to stop him. Seb found me sitting on the couch, my face buried in my hands. "He knows," I said, my voice trembling. Seb sat down beside me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice soft. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it's not going to be easy." That night, as I lay awake in bed, I found myself replaying the argument with Dean, his words echoing in my mind. "Do you even love me anymore?" The truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know if I ever had, or if I'd simply convinced myself that I did because it was easier than admitting the alternative. What I did know was that my life was unraveling, and there was no going back. When you've lived with a secret long enough, it starts to shape you. It curls around your decisions, whispers in your silences, and stands between you and the people who think they know you. That night, after Dean left, I felt the full weight of the choices I'd made. Seb's presence beside me on the couch should have been a comfort, but instead, it was a reminder of the thin line we'd crossed. A line I wasn't sure we could ever come back from. The next morning, I woke to an empty house. Dean hadn't returned, and Seb was nowhere to be seen. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I moved through the motions of my morning routine, showering, making coffee, tidying the kitchen, but everything felt off, like I was living someone else's life. I kept checking my phone, half expecting a message from Dean, but the screen stayed dark. Part of me wanted to call him to try to explain, but I didn't know where to start. What could I say that wouldn't make things worse? It wasn't until late afternoon that Seb came home. I heard the front door open and his footsteps in the hall, but I didn't move from my spot on the couch. "Elise," he said softly, stepping into the room. I turned to face him, my chest tightening at the look in his eyes. "I think I should leave," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't fair to you, or to Dean," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I thought staying here would help me figure things out, but it's just made everything more complicated." "You don't have to leave," I said quickly, my heart pounding. "Yes, I do," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "It's the only way any of us can move forward." I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Where will you go?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll figure it out." Dean came home that evening, his expression hard and unreadable. He barely looked at me as he set his bag down and walked into the kitchen. "Did you eat?" I asked hesitantly, following him. "I'm fine," he replied curtly, pouring himself a glass of water. The silence between us was suffocating. I wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the growing chasm, but I didn't know where to start. Finally, he set his glass down and turned to face me. "Do you love him?" he asked. His voice quiet but filled with pain. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "Dean, I began, but the words caught in my throat. He nodded, his expression tightening. "That's what I thought." The next day, Seb packed his things. I watched from the doorway as he stuffed clothes into a duffel bag, my chest aching with every movement. When he was finished, he turned to face me, his expression soft but resolute. "I'll miss you," he said simply. I nodded, unable to speak. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine briefly before he pulled away. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And then he was gone. With Seb gone, the house felt emptier than ever. Dean and I moved through our days like strangers, exchanging only the bare minimum of words. The tension between us was unbearable, but neither of us seemed willing or able to address it. One evening, as we sat in the living room in silence, Dean finally spoke. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I looked at him, my chest tightening. "What do you mean?" he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This marriage, whatever we've been pretending it is, it's over, Elise." The words hit me like a blow, but deep down, I knew he was right. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. It was amicable, as far as divorces go, but the process was still painful. Signing those papers felt like closing the door on a part of my life I wasn't ready to let go of, even if it had been falling apart for years. Afterward, I moved into a small apartment downtown. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom. One day, a few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, and my heart skipped a beat as I opened it. Dear Elise, I hope this finds you well. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, wondering how you're doing. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but I know it was the right decision. I wanted to thank you for everything. For seeing me when no one else did, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever find, a sense of purpose. I'm doing better now, working on something I think you'd be proud of. I hope you find happiness, Elise. You deserve it. Always, Seb. Tears blurred my vision as I folded the letter, clutching it to my chest. Looking back, I can see how everything unraveled. The choices I made, the lines I crossed, they were born from a place of longing and pain I didn't fully understand at the time. But I've learned to forgive myself, even if others never will. Life isn't perfect, and neither are we. But sometimes, in the midst of the chaos, we find clarity and the strength to start over.